thought today we could talk about skills. Now, I'm going to talk about them in Claude Code, which you've probably seen them in before, but they are generally applicable to most editors, which is pretty interesting. And I figured I'd talk about these because I've released a couple open source ones for Datadog, as well as there is some, I guess, a little bit more caveats than I thought about making what's ultimately a markdown file that helps steer your context. And I thought I could talk about maybe go back a little bit because I feel like a lot of people are using skills, but may not be aware of how they actually work. So there's some wrinkles and things like that in there, but I thought I'd go over a quick overview of what skills are, how you can use them, how I created the ones for Datadog, and then how you could extend skills or create your own skills, essentially. All right, so this is the Claude page for, sorry, the Anthropic page for Claude Code, and this is introducing the skills. Now, the main part of this is that there's a skill MD file, which is a markdown file, but it's also a markdown file with frontmatter. So it's a markdown file that could also have some YAML at the top, essentially. I'm going to quickly go through some of these. There's some built-in skills here, but if we look at the skill code itself, so to create a skill, you would essentially create a directory in your home folder. I'll zoom in a little bit here on this. So essentially like this, you'd make a directory in your home folder for skills, and this one's called explain code. And then when you write the skill itself, it's essentially just, so you can see this front matter at the top, so the 3 dashes and then the front matter. So this is essentially some tagging. So we've got a name tag, a description field, and then in here is the actual skill itself. Now, apologies, there's this ask a question on the bottom here, but essentially it's just plain text. So you go through and say, like, what are the things that need to be done? And following these instructions, Claude would use this to steer, or you would use this to steer Claude's response, essentially. So prior to having this, in the way that it explains code might be different, but because in this case, we're starting with an analogy, so explain it to me like I'm 5 or something like that would be an alternative here. There's also draw a diagram, so show me visually what we're talking about, and then walk through the code that we're talking about. So line by line, let's walk through it. This could take a little while if it's a big piece of code, but it'll actually split into paragraphs, which is nice. And then finally, highlight a gotcha. So if there is a common mistake or misconception here, show it to me. Now, this is just an example skill, but you'll notice that it's primarily in natural language. So it's not code. It's really more of like a guideline or a to-do. I don't know if you ever had a run book being on call, but it feels to me something like that, like what to know before you go, essentially. So prior to do something, the user has said, hey, look at the skill over here, and then this will be added to the context. And using these instructions or a lookup table or what have you, the agent will then go and give you a response. So I think that's like high-level overview of what the skills are doing. And I just want to talk about some that I created that I thought might be a good example. So I've made a few agent skills in the Datadog Labs repo. So this is sort of our experimental area. We can play around a little bit more and release things to the public a little bit faster. So I've got a few skills exported here, and I thought I would talk about the Pup one. So Pup is a new Datadog CLI command line interface, and we do have an MCP server as well, which is similar but not the same as the CLI. I think the main thing that's different for this kind of tool is an MCP server with all its tools can live in your context and be very handy to use, but there could be times where you want more tools than that, but you don't want to bundle them all in the context, or you may want to pick 1 or 2 tools without grabbing all. I think when I started this, I had 47 and they expanded to 108, but that's too much context if you want to add it all, because you won't be using all those skills at once. So I'll talk about the Pup one. So imagine this is a CLI that OAuth authenticates to Datadog, and after doing that, allows you to do things with Datadog. So imagine a way for you to essentially curl the API and get responses back. Now, going through here, there's quite a few things that you can do with the Pup CLI, but the main thing is make sure that you log in and that it hits the API, and then from there we can define what it's actually doing. So again, this is a Go command. We've recently upgraded it to Rust, but essentially it's a command with some arguments. So all this skill is doing is saying when you want to do this, use the CLI, and using the CLI, you'll get answers back. So it's pretty straightforward. Now it essentially has like a table and shows you some prerequisites and things like this. It's got some authentication in here. And if you want it to, you could also add it to CI with an app key or an API key or both. Now, if you want to read from it, you can hit the monitors, what have you, that works. And I just want to quickly show a session where I've gone through and looked at one of my hackathon demos that we were playing with a couple weeks ago. So if we go into the skills demo here, I'm just going to scroll all the way to the top. So here is me loading the skills. So just showing which ones are there. So it's just a slash command. And using slash skills, you can add new skills if you want to, or show the ones that are there. And I'll do that in a moment. And in this case, I said, okay, now look at the Datadog logs and show me if there are any issues. And it did. It went through the logs. But I think the first one here is that it says the skill is loaded and it's going to see if the CLI is installed. It did in fact find it installed and then it checked to see if it's authenticated. But this is a key point. You've got to actually tell it if it's not installed, how would you install the CLI? Or if it's not there, is there a failback or fail-proof? Or do we just tell the user that it's not there? Something like that. And then further on, you can see that it's authenticated and it's working. And it went through and it found some issues. So there are some issues in here. So in this case, I deployed something to GCP as a test, and it was having some issues because I haven't looked at it in a minute. And then going down, I could say, hey, what do the docs say about this? So using the Datadog docs skill, look up Datadog docs and tell me a little bit more information about what happened. And what's nice about this is, though I did this in sequence, so I did one looking at the logs, and then I asked it to check the docs. You could actually combine these together, which is really powerful. So when you've got like a mixture of these 5 skills I was talking about, you can combine a couple. So you can say, hey, using Pup, make sure you've logged in, then check the logs, and using what you've got from the logs, look up the docs and give me some advice or some things to do next, essentially. Now, these are very, very simple skills. If you want to clone them or fork them and add to them, by all means, go ahead. I think, though, when you're trying to make your own skills, what I typically use is a way of going through essentially just saying like, hey, I want to make a skill, Claude, can you make a skill to do this? Which is an easy 0-shot or 1-shot exercise. However, what I found is maybe a little bit easier is having Claude do something and then say, make a skill for it, or doing that and say, use the skill creator skill. So Anthropic released a Claude Code skill creator skill that allows you to essentially use the skill to create better skills. And I want to use this as an example because it's got some things that aren't required, but are extras. In particular, if you look in here, there's a license for one thing, so you can license your skill itself, but there's also folders. Now, there are a couple in here that are common. So references and scripts are common folder names that you'll see a lot. The agents, assets, and eval viewer are a little bit different, but they're specific to this tool. So we'll leave those there for now, but you can imagine that there'd be instructions for agents, or maybe if you've got assets like a JPEG that you want to include in a slide skill, or maybe like a logo that you're using a lot in your web designs, or perhaps it's a CSS file that's got a lot of rules about what your CSS should look like, you could put those in assets. But under references, if you wanted to do something like, in our case, we had a doc skill, I could actually have a lightweight lookup table. We've got an LLMs.txt on docs.datadoghq.com, for example. I could actually include this in this file instead of saying, hey, go to the web and find this. I could say, here's one that's timestamped from February. If the date's longer than this date, go check again. Otherwise, refer to this as probably correct. The other is these scripts here. Now, I talked a bit about that Pup CLI, but if that Pup CLI was in Bash, for example, which is how I started, or Python, which is also something I tried, those scripts where you could run it on the client device, you could actually probably include those as part of this. Now, because Pup's a binary, we thought that's not the best idea to include something essentially that's a little bit harder to inspect. So if I want to make sure that when we're distributing skills, the users can see the code very easily. So it was pretty important to me. But if we go into scripts here, you can see that you could actually have helper scripts. So in this case, there's an eval for it, there's a loop for it, there's a quick validate, for example, so you could go to and validate your skill, which is pretty handy. A lot of times what I found, for example, is that I'll make front matter that I think is valid, but it's not necessarily valid for the skill is what I get stuck on all the time. So remember that even though you can put in whatever you want into the skill front matter, you're probably going to want to put things into the metadata as opposed to the freeform fields that you see at the top. At any rate, so this is a quick overview. And if you want to find more skills, what I found is pretty handy is skills.sh. And this is from Vercel. You probably recognize the logo. And then you can see that you can do npx skills find, npx skills add, for example. And in here, there are actually some Datadog skills, which I will pull up. And I think this morning I actually saw that some of the skills that we were just looking at actually hit the top of this. They did, in fact. So Pup is actually at the top of this list now when you look for Datadog, which is awesome. But there are a lot of skills in here, and they're actually Datadog skills from other people that they found useful. So if you find that you want to mix and match, or we haven't released something yet, or you've got a suggestion for me, by all means, let me know. But I think this is a good area to go to find other skills which might be helpful for you, or if you're making your own, to be able to refer to Vercel skills, or what have you. So long story short, I've been using skills a lot because I find MCP servers tend to take up a lot of context, especially when they have many tools, which is very handy. But if you find that you're only using one or two tools, the skills might be a better use of your time. And you can still push out 47, 97, 108 skill definitions in your skills, but you can install one at a time. And you can do something called progressive disclosure when it comes to your context for your skills. So instead of having all of the MCP tools disclosed at the top, you can actually disclose the skills as you go along. So it means that the context that you're using can be minimal while at the same time being very handy with your skills at it.
Okay. Another way for us to expand on Claude and its capabilities, and it seems like we've got actually a conversation going in our back channel with an advocacy about some of the things that you were just showing, and also MCP and the conversation around like when to use one over the other,
Right.
and the just the volume of token usage that MCP server uses is always one of the first thing, if not the first thing, that people bring up in terms of like there's just a lot of context and tokens that are being shared, maybe unnecessarily. Might be over engineering, depending on your use case. But it's good to know that these skills, it's just markdown. We can actually kind of dial in Claude and CLI tools like Pup or whatever else, combination of tools, and maybe do some of the same types of things that MCP is also capable of giving us.
You got it. And for the confused matters, you could have an MCP server that's not necessarily loaded all the time, and the skill could maybe load it for you and unload it when it's done. It gets a little bit complicated as to what you want, but I can see the benefits of having an MCP server when you're running a local daemon. You get a lot of power. And if there are a lot of hoops to jump through authentication, or if the API is fairly complex, it makes sense to have a tool for it, so to have a server. But it feels like there's definitely a pull between the two. So the MCP server might be the right thing to do for all the tools together, whereas something lighter might be a skill, and then between the two you can have skills that go with CLIs and CLIs that call MCPs. So I feel like there's a progression there that goes through depending on what you're doing with the MCP server itself.
Okay, cool. Well, Ryan, as always, appreciate the insight on our latest with AI tools. In this case, Claude Skills. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jason.
Bye.